Somewhere on the southwestern coast of Greenland there are ruins, stone walls half buried in the permafrost, the foundations of churches, farmhouses, barns. If you flew over them today, you might mistake them for natural formations, just rocks arranged by wind and time, but they weren't. People built those walls, people who had names, who raised children, who argued with their neighbours over grazing rights, who prayed on Sunday mornings and traded goods across the North Atlantic. And then, at some point in the mid-1400s, every single one of them was gone. Not displaced, not evacuated, gone. No farewell letter, no mass grave that anyone has found, no clear explanation written down by the people who lived it. Just silence, and stone, and one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in the history of human civilization. Here's what we know for certain. For nearly 500 years, Norse settlers lived and died in Greenland. This wasn't a temporary outpost or a brief expedition. It was a functioning society. They had farms, a cathedral, a bishop, legal assemblies, trade networks stretching back to Norway and Iceland. At its peak, the colony may have held somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people, spread across two main settlement areas on the island's southwestern edge. These were real communities, not legend, not myth. The archaeology proves it. The written records confirm it. The bones of their cattle are still in the ground. And then the colony vanished. Now, historians and archaeologists have been wrestling with this for decades, and the honest answer is that nobody knows exactly what happened. That's not a cop-out. That's the reality of trying to reconstruct the final years of a small, remote society from the scraps of evidence that survived 7 centuries of ice, isolation, and neglect. The written sources go thin right when things get interesting. The last confirmed document from the colony itself dates to 1408. Ooh. After that, the paper trail basically dies. What we're left with is archaeology, climate data, analysis of animal bones and pollen samples, and a handful of outside accounts from people who visited or heard rumours second-hand. What makes this mystery so compelling is that there isn't one clean answer waiting at the end. There are at least 5 serious explanations, and the most likely truth involves several of them tangled together. Climate change is a major factor. The medieval warm period that made Greenland habitable in the first place eventually gave way to something colder, more brutal, more relentless. Economic collapse plays a role too. The trade goods that made the colony valuable to Europe stopped being valuable right when the settlers needed the relationship most. There are questions about conflict with the Inuit, who were moving into the same territory from the north. There are signs of food stress in the archaeological record that suggest slow starvation rather than sudden catastrophe. And underneath all of it, there are choices. Choices made in Greenland, choices made in Norway, choices made in Rome that quietly sealed the colony's fate long before the last person walked away from the last farm. What's remarkable is how long they held on. 5 centuries. Think about that. These settlers arrived around 985 AD, and the colony endured through Viking Age politics, through the Black Death reshaping Europe, through sea ice years so bad that supply ships stopped coming. They adapted, at least for a while. They were not passive victims of circumstance. They were resourceful, stubborn, and deeply committed to a way of life they had built from nearly nothing on the edge of the known world. But commitment only takes you so far when the world stops cooperating. Over the next sections, we're going to trace the whole arc of this story, from the moment Erik the Red first sailed into those fjords to the final years when the lights were going out one farmstead at a time. We'll follow the evidence carefully, and when the evidence runs out, we'll say so rather than pretend the gaps don't exist. Before we go any further, though, I want to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. It's always wild to me that people are watching these at midnight in Melbourne and over morning coffee in Montreal at the exact same moment. Tell me where you are. It genuinely makes this feel less like shouting into the void. Now, let's go to Greenland. To understand why this story ends the way it does, you have to understand what Greenland actually is. Not the name, which is famously misleading, and not the vague idea of it as some frozen wasteland at the edge of the map. The real Greenland, the physical place. Because the geography shapes everything that follows. Greenland is enormous. It's the world's largest island, roughly the size of Western Europe, if you folded the continent into a rough rectangle. But almost none of it is livable in any conventional sense. About 80% of the island sits under an ice sheet that in places reaches nearly 2 miles thick. That ice sheet is not a glacier in the picturesque sense. It is a crushing, continent-wide weight of frozen water that has been building for millions of years and shows no interest in moving. The interior is essentially another planet, cold, featureless, hostile to anything biological. But the edges tell a different story. The southwestern coastline, where the Norse eventually settled, is carved into one of the most dramatic fjord systems on Earth. Deep water channels pushing inland for 60, 80, 100 miles, flanked by mountains and opening into sheltered valleys where the sea ice breaks up earlier than anywhere else on the island. These valleys have soil. In summer, real summer, short and fierce and almost shockingly green. Grasses grow thick enough to support livestock. Wildflowers appear. Caribou graze. The rivers run with Arctic char. The sea just offshore fills with ring seals and harp seals, and occasionally walrus hauled out on rocky beaches. For roughly 4 to 5 months of the year, this landscape looks and functions almost like a rough version of Iceland or the northern Scottish coast. Almost. The catch is everything outside that window. Winter in the southwestern fjords is not just cold, it's variable in a way that makes planning nearly impossible. Sea ice can lock up the fjords for months, cutting off access to hunting grounds and making any kind of maritime travel a gamble. Storm systems roll in off the North Atlantic with almost no warning. Summer pasture, the critical resource for any farming economy, can be good for 3 seasons in a row and then collapse in the 4th because the snow came early and stayed late. The fjord system that looks so promising on a map is also a trap. It channels cold air inland, creates its own micro-weather systems, and rewards optimism with occasional catastrophic seasons. And people already knew this. Long before any Norse sailor spotted the Greenlandic coast, humans had been working out how to survive here. The earliest Arctic peoples, what archaeologists call the Independence One and Sakat cultures, were moving through the high Arctic and along Greenland's coast somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. These weren't primitive wanderers stumbling around in the cold. They were specialists, extraordinarily adapted to an environment that would kill an unprepared person within hours. They hunted muskox and caribou. They took seals through the sea ice using techniques refined over generations. They built structures clever enough to trap body heat in temperatures that dropped to -40. Their technology was elegant precisely because it had no margin for error. In a place like Greenland, the wrong tool or the wrong decision at the wrong moment isn't an inconvenience. It's a death sentence. These early cultures came and went. The Independence 2 people followed, and then the Dorset culture, which flourished across the eastern Arctic for roughly 2,000 years before its own disappearance, still not fully understood sometime around the 1st millennium AD. What their presence tells us is something important. Greenland was not empty because it was impossible. It was intermittently occupied because it was difficult, and surviving there required a very specific relationship with the environment, one built on hunting rather than farming, on following seasonal resource cycles rather than trying to impose a fixed agricultural calendar on a landscape that didn't cooperate with one. The southwestern fjords, where grass and sheltered valleys created something resembling arable land, could theoretically support a farming economy. That's the zone where the Norse would eventually concentrate. But even there, the margin between viable and catastrophic was narrow enough that a farming mindset, without significant hunting supplementation, was probably not going to last forever. The rest of Greenland, the north, the east, the high interior coasts, belonged entirely to a hunting economy. It couldn't be farmed. It never would be. It required a different kind of knowledge and a different relationship with the land entirely. What makes this complicated is that Greenland didn't exist in isolation. The North Atlantic in the early medieval period was less of a barrier and more of a highway, if you knew the currents and the seasons and you weren't afraid of open water. The Norse were building on an existing tradition of North Atlantic maritime travel that stretched back further than their own culture. Iceland was settled around 870 AD. The Faroe Islands before that. The sea routes connecting Norway, the Faroes, Iceland, and eventually Greenland followed predictable wind and current patterns that experienced sailors could read well enough to make passages with reasonable reliability. Not safe, not predictable in any modern sense, but knowable in the way that dangerous things become knowable after generations of people risk their lives learning them. This connected world meant that Greenland, even at its most remote, was never truly isolated during the centuries the Norse were there. Goods moved, people moved, information moved slowly and imperfectly, but it moved. A ship leaving Bergen in Norway could reach Greenland in a matter of weeks under good conditions. That same ship would carry news, trade goods, sometimes clergy, sometimes livestock, sometimes settlers. The colony was always understood to be part of a larger economic and cultural network, not a standalone civilization. And that dependency, as we'll see, cuts both ways. Connection is survival when the connection holds. When it starts to fray, isolation reasserts itself fast. But here is the thing that doesn't get said enough about Greenland before any of this happened. The island was already whispering what it was capable of doing to human ambition. Every culture that had come before the Norse had eventually left or been replaced, or simply ended. The Dorset people managed roughly 2,000 years in the eastern Arctic, and then vanished as a distinct culture sometime around the same period the Norse arrived. Whether they died out, merged with other populations, or simply changed enough to become unrecognizable in the archaeological record is still debated. What's not debated is that a culture that had been extraordinarily successful in this environment for 2 millennia eventually stopped existing here in its original form. Greenland had done that before, it would do it again. The island sits at the intersection of promise and punishment. The southwestern fjords offer just enough green, just enough soil, just enough summer to make you believe you can build something permanent. And you can, for a while. You can build farms and churches and legal assemblies. You can raise children who have never seen anywhere else and who consider this place home. You can last 5 centuries. But the island holds certain terms in the fine print of every season, terms written in ice advance and sea current and storm track, and the brutal arithmetic of calories, and eventually those terms come due. The Norse who arrived in the late 10th century didn't know that yet. They saw the fjords in summer. They saw the grass. They had already made Iceland work, and Iceland had looked impossible too. They were optimists in the specific way that people become optimists after surviving a series of improbable things. They had no reason to believe this would be different. They were wrong. But it would take 500 years for the full bill to arrive. The man who started all of this was not, by any measure, a reassuring figure. Erik Thorvaldsson, known as Erik the Red, arrived in Iceland as a child with his father, who had been expelled from Norway for manslaughter. Erik himself was later expelled from Iceland for manslaughter. There is a pattern here, and the sagas don't try to hide it. He was violent, stubborn, and apparently incapable of settling disputes in any way that didn't end with someone dead. In roughly 982 AD, after killing neighbours in a feud over some borrowed roof beams, he was declared an outlaw and given 3 years to be somewhere else. He chose to go west toward rumours of land that Icelanders had already glimpsed from a distance, but never seriously explored. What he found, after sailing into the unknown with no guarantee of return, was the southwestern coastline we've already described. The fjords, the summer grass, the sheltered valleys running inland from the sea. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring it methodically, moving up and down the coast, naming features after himself and his companions, taking stock of what the land could offer. And when his exile ended and he sailed back to Iceland, he made a decision that tells you almost everything you need to know about how colonization actually works. He called it Greenland. The sagas are remarkably candid about why. One account says explicitly that he thought people would be more interested in going there if it had an attractive name. This is a medieval Icelander inventing real estate marketing, and it worked. He returned to Greenland in 985 or 986 AD, with somewhere between 14 and 25 ships, depending on which source you trust, carrying settlers, livestock, tools, and all the social infrastructure of a Norse community in transit. Storms and mishaps reduced the fleet significantly before it arrived, but enough ships made it, and enough people survived the crossing to begin something permanent, or permanent enough to last 5 centuries, which at the time probably felt like the same thing. The eastern settlement, which the Norse called the Eystrabygd, took shape in the deep fjord systems of the far southwest in the area around what is now the modern town of Qaqortoq. This was the most favourable zone on the island, the place where the growing season ran longest, and the sheltered valleys offered the best combination of pasture and protection from coastal storms. Farms spread through these valleys in a pattern that would have looked recognisable to anyone from Iceland or Western Norway. The Norse didn't impose a grid or a planned townscape. They followed the land, siting farmsteads where fresh water was accessible, where south-facing slopes caught maximum sun, where the hayfields could be cut and dried before the first frost. The best-positioned farm became Erik's own holding at Brattahlid, on the inner arm of Eriksfjord, which is now Tunuliafik. It was not coincidental that the man who organised the expedition claimed the prime real estate. What the settlers brought with them mattered enormously, and it's worth being specific. They brought cattle, sheep, goats, and horses. These animals were not incidental cargo. They were the entire economic logic of the colony. Norse farming at this period was built around livestock in a way that's easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. Cattle provided milk, butter, cheese, and eventual meat. Sheep provided wool for cloth and milk in addition to meat. Horses were working animals and status symbols. The whole agricultural calendar was organised around keeping these animals alive through winter, which meant cutting enough hay in summer to feed them through months when nothing grew. In Greenland, that arithmetic was tighter than anywhere the Norse had farmed before. The growing season was shorter, the winters longer and less predictable, and there was no margin for a bad hay year without animals beginning to die. They also brought ironworking knowledge. This is underappreciated. Greenland has no indigenous source of iron ore that was economically accessible to the Norse, which meant they either had to import raw iron or work with what they carried and could later trade for. The ability to manufacture and repair iron tools, farm implements, weapons, boat fittings was not optional. It was the difference between a functioning community and one slowly falling apart as its equipment failed, and they brought institutions. The Thing, the Norse legal assembly where disputes were adjudicated and community decisions made, was established in Greenland as it had been in Iceland. This wasn't sentiment, it was infrastructure. A dispersed population of farmers living across dozens of miles of fjord country needed some mechanism to coordinate, resolve conflicts, and maintain collective identity. The law was that mechanism. The church would eventually reinforce it, but the legal assembly came first and in some ways ran deeper. The early challenges announced themselves immediately. The growing season that had looked promising in summer revealed its true character over the first few winters. Hay had to be cut, dried, and stored in quantities that required constant labour and near-perfect timing. Supply ships from Iceland and Norway were not reliable, not in any modern logistical sense. A community at the end of a sea lane dependent on favourable winds and willing merchants was always one bad sailing season away from shortage. The settlers had crossed an ocean to build something permanent, and what they'd actually built, without fully knowing it yet, was a society balanced on the edge of what the land could sustain. They made it work, for a while. If you had walked into the eastern settlement 100 years after Erik the Red, it would not have felt like a remote outpost at the end of the world. It would have felt like a small, familiar piece of Norway that had somehow been picked up and set down in a harsher, stranger landscape. Power in Greenland, as far as we can tell, followed the same pattern as in Iceland and Western Norway. There were no kings on the fjords, there were chieftains, wealthy farm owners, men like Erik and later his descendants, who controlled the best land, the most livestock, and the crucial networks of obligation that tied smaller households to them. These were not landlords in the modern sense, they were more like nodal points in a web of favours, protection, and prestige. If your roof needed rebuilding, if your boat needed repairing, if you got into a feud you couldn't manage, you turned to a local chieftain. In return, you attended his feasts, worked on his big projects, followed his lead at the assembly, and if necessary went with him when disputes turned violent. The Thing, that legal assembly we mentioned, stitched all of this together. Once or twice a year, depending on how you reconstruct the sources, farmers from up and down the fjords would converge on a designated meeting place. They brought legal cases, marriage negotiations, trade goods, grievances that had been simmering all winter. The law in Norse society wasn't just a written code kept in a book somewhere. It lived in people's heads and in the memories of law speakers who recited it aloud. Disputes over boundaries, inheritances, and accidental killings, of which there were many in a hard landscape full of sharp metal and unstable cliffs, were argued publicly. Witnesses spoke. Compensation was set. Outlaws were declared when no compromise could be reached. Greenland's Thing mirrored Iceland's, but with a twist. It was smaller, more concentrated, and in a very real sense more fragile. A bad year could kill off key families. A ship that never arrived could erase a vital link to the outside legal world in Norway and Iceland, where larger disputes might be appealed. Authority was local and very personal. If a prominent chieftain's line died out or declined, the balance of power shifted, sometimes abruptly. Overlaying this legal scaffolding came a second, equally powerful structure, the church. Within a few generations of settlement, Greenland wasn't just loosely Christian in some cultural sense, it was plugged into the machinery of medieval Christendom. Churches were built on major farms. A bishopric was established at Gardar, near modern Igaliku, around 1126. That's a formal ecclesiastical seat, with a bishop appointed out of Norway, responsible in theory for the souls of everyone in the colony. The church rerouted the flow of wealth in subtle ways. Every household was supposed to pay tithes, a tenth of certain kinds of produce or income. Butter, cloth, meat, and, critically, valuable export goods like walrus ivory and hides could be owed to the church. Some of this supported local clergy, some, at least in principle, travelled back across the sea as payments and fees. This mattered politically. The Greenlanders swore allegiance to the Norwegian crown in the 13th century, but in practice the most consistent external authority in their lives was ecclesiastical. A bishop's letters, when ships actually made it through, connected them to a network that ran from the Norwegian coast all the way to Rome. The church also provided legal tools. Ecclesiastical courts handled marriage, inheritance, and moral offences. If you wanted to secure your farm for your heirs, or donate a portion of your estate to buy prayers for your soul, you were operating within this church-centred system. But the impressive words, chieftain, bishop, assembly, crown, tell you almost nothing about what life felt like for most people. Daily life in Greenland was built out of turf and bone and stored calories. A typical farmstead house was a long, low structure, thick-walled and half sunk into the ground. Stone formed the outer shell, but the real insulation came from turf, sliced blocks of grass and soil stacked into dense living bricks. Inside, a continuous bench ran along the walls, packed with straw and skins for sleeping. A central hearth, or a line of hearths, provided heat and a place to cook. The air was smoky, dim, and precious. In winter, you spent most of your waking and sleeping hours inside that compressed world, with family, servants, children, and livestock sounds drifting in from attached byres. Summer was the season when everything had to happen at once. Grass had to be cut by hand with iron scythes and sickles turned and stacked before autumn rains could rot it. Streams and marsh edges were scythed, hill pastures grazed in tight schedules. Some people moved temporarily to sheelings, seasonal shelters farther up the valleys, while the best lower fields were saved for hay. Others headed to the outer coast to hunt seals at the ice edge or gather seabirds and eggs. Work was communal out of necessity. You helped neighbours with haymaking and slaughtering, and they helped you because if one farm failed completely, the shockwaves could spread. Fewer animals to trade, fewer hands to call on, fewer allies at the thing. Large tasks, building a boat, re-roofing a hall, driving livestock between pastures, were social events and survival strategies rolled into one. Food storage was the hidden foundation under all of this. Archaeologists have found storage pits, byres with built-in manure management, and cellars where meat and dairy could be kept cool. Cattle and sheep were slaughtered in autumn to limit the number of mouths eating through the hay. Meat was dried, smoked, or sometimes simply frozen in pits and crevices where permafrost and cold air did the work. Butter and cheese were ways of moving summer milk into winter. If you miscalculated, if the summer was too wet to cure hay properly, or a storm wiped out your seal hunt, you didn't just tighten your belt. You faced the possibility of losing animals, and once your breeding stock dropped below a certain threshold, the slide into poverty was hard to reverse. We know these patterns not just from sagas, but from the dirt itself. Excavations at farms across the eastern and western settlements have produced huge quantities of animal bones, plant remains, and household debris. By sorting and analysing these, archaeologists can reconstruct diet with surprising precision. High-status farms show a lot of cattle bones, especially cuts associated with prime meat, and evidence of imported goods like wheel-made pottery and glass. Humble sites skew more heavily towards sheep, goats, and over time, seals and fish. Pollen and microscopic plant remains preserved in bogs, and lake sediments reveal when meadows were cleared, which grasses were grown, and how intensely the land was grazed. Settlement patterns also tell a story. The best land, inner fjords with long-growing seasons, was taken early and held by the major chieftain families and church farms. Smaller holdings crept up the valleys and out toward the more marginal wind-scoured patches of soil. Over the centuries you can see a gradient of security. Big central farms with stone churches and multiple outbuildings, then medium farms with decent fields, then tiny, precarious places on the fringes that must have lived year to year on the edge of viability. Across all of it runs the same invisible constraint: environment. Greenland in the so-called medieval warm period offered a narrow window in which Norse-style farming could function this far north. The balance was exquisite. Just enough warmth in summer to grow hay, just enough predictability in sea ice to make seal hunting and travel possible, just enough trade reaching across the Atlantic to replace worn iron and supply occasional luxuries. Their social system, chieftains, thing, church, kin networks, was essentially a machine for managing that balance. Laws settled conflicts before they destroyed communities that were too small to absorb feuds. Tithes and church estates redistributed some wealth, smoothing over shocks. Communal work and reciprocal obligation tried to keep marginal households from falling off the cliff in a single bad year. But when you build a whole society on a tight environmental margin, every decision, every winter, and every storm carries more weight than you realize. The system looked stable from the inside. From our vantage point, knowing how the climate would shift, you can see how delicately it was poised. If the eastern settlement was the heart of Norse Greenland, the western settlement was its outstretched hand, reaching farther into the cold. Geographically, it sat about 500 kilometres to the north and west of the eastern settlement, clustered around the inner ends of a few fjords near modern Nuuk. Same broad idea. Farms tucked up where saltwater fingers met higher, more sheltered ground. Same mix of turf houses, byres and small churches. But if you lay the two regions side by side, the differences jump out. The eastern settlement was bigger. More farms, more people, a bishop's seat, a legal assembly that probably drew households from multiple fjords. It had the best combination of arable land, shelter and sea routes. Call it the core. The western settlement never reached that scale. At its height, it may have held a few hundred people scattered across a couple's dozen farms. There was at least one church, so they had their own parish structure, their own local priest reciting mass while ice drifted past in the fjord. But no bishop, no cathedral farm, no grand concentration of power and wealth. It was a satellite, and everyone there would have known it. So why did it exist at all? Because for a society like this, where survival was a three-way negotiation between land, sea and social ties, the western settlement offered two things that the eastern could not guarantee in the same way: access and insurance. Access, first of all, to the outer coast and the rich hunting grounds beyond. From the western settlement's farms, it was a shorter journey to the Davis Strait, where drift ice, migrating seals, and crucially walrus congregated. Walrus weren't just big animals, they were an export commodity. Their tusks, hides, and even rope made from their skin tied Greenland into European trade networks. We'll come back to that economy later, but for now it's enough to note: the best walrus grounds lay closer to the western settlement. Second, insurance. In a world where a single failed hay harvest could cripple a household, spreading your population out over multiple fjord systems was a kind of social risk management. If one region had bad grazing or an epidemic among livestock, another might scrape by. Families in the western settlement were often kin to people in the eastern. Marriages and fosterage created cross-settlement ties. In a good year, that just meant news, visits, and maybe a few traded animals. In a bad year, it meant lifelines. But pushing farther into the north came with a cost. The western settlement lived closer to the edge. The growing season was shorter. The inland ice sheet loomed closer, chilling winds flowing down the valleys. Pastures were more limited, and the margin for error even thinner than in the eastern settlement. Archaeological work at sites like Sandon, one of the largest western farms, shows a similar basic pattern of mixed farming: cattle, sheep, goats, but with a heavier and earlier reliance on hunting. You can imagine the seasonal rhythm. In spring and early summer, households focused on their fields and meadows just like their cousins back east, sowing small barley plots where possible, repairing fences, cutting and stacking hay. But from these inner fjord farms radiated routes outward, over passes, along shorelines, through narrow sounds, that led to seasonal hunting stations on the outer coast. These weren't just casual trips. They were planned campaigns. Men and sometimes whole family groups moved to temporary camps closer to the seal migration routes and bird cliffs. Boats followed leads in the sea ice to intercept seals resting at the edge. Farther north and west, organised parties headed for walrus haul-outs, where a single successful season could produce tusks and hides worth more in European terms than all the butter you could churn in a year. These routes didn't just connect farm to coast, They linked farm to farm, fjord to fjord, paths along ridgelines, boat crossings between sheltered inlets, winter journeys over snow and frozen water, built an internal map of Greenland that never appears in the sagas, but is written into the distribution of sites. A family at a marginal little holding might spend part of the year in the orbit of a larger chieftain farm, then peel off with a hunting party that included people from multiple households. News, gossip, trade goods, marriage proposals, all moved along these same tracks. For a couple of centuries this pattern seems to have worked. The Western settlement never became rich, but it was not just a desperate fringe. Some of its farms had stone churches and sizable buyers. Animal bones show people eating cattle and sheep, not just scraping by on seal blubber. Imported goods, iron, a few luxury items, did make their way that far. Then the balance started to shift. When archaeologists excavate Western settlement sites, they see changes that look small in isolation but ominous as a pattern. Over time, the ratio of bones changes. Cattle, which require the best hay and most stable conditions, decline. Sheep and goats, which can handle rougher grazing, take a larger share. Seals and other marine animals become increasingly dominant in the trash heaps. That suggests a gradual pivot away from cattle-based farming toward heavier reliance on hunting. In some places, building phases tell another part of the story. Houses get rebuilt smaller, outbuildings fall out of use and are not replaced. Fields that were once maintained start to show signs of erosion and neglect in the soil record. Pollen studies indicate that areas previously kept open as meadow start reverting, slowly, toward more natural vegetation as grazing pressure changes. None of this looks like a dramatic collapse. It looks like people making the best of a tightening situation. And then, at some point in the 14th century, the Western settlement vanishes from the written record. A visiting Icelander in the 1350s notes that no one is living there anymore. Later sources speak of it as already abandoned. What did that abandonment actually look like on the ground? It probably was not a single cinematic moment where every family walked away at once. More likely, households peeled off over a generation or two, a bad sequence of summers, a couple of failed hunts, too many animals lost in one winter. A family with kin in the eastern settlement decides to move back east, selling or simply leaving their land. A neighbouring farm hangs on a bit longer, marrying off a daughter into the eastern fjords and sending a younger son to serve in a chieftain's household there. Another farm breaks when the older generation dies and no one is willing to keep fighting with marginal fields and failing buyers. From the outside, looking at archaeological layers, this shows up as sites that just stop being used. There is no burn layer, no mass grave, no neat line where everyone suddenly vanishes. Artifacts are left where they fell, floors accumulate one last layer of wind-blown sand and animal droppings, and then time moves on without them. From the inside, it probably felt like a string of individual decisions, each one rational at the time. This place is no longer worth it. There's still a chance somewhere else. In that sense, the Western settlement functions for us as an early warning signal. Whatever pressures eventually broke Norse life in Greenland, climate cooling, shifting trade, social rigidity, conflict with new Inuit arrivals, seem to have hit hardest first on this northern fringe. The Western settlement reached its limits earlier. It adjusted, more hunting, smaller herds, tight kin networks. For a while, that worked. Then, gradually, it just emptied out. By the time the very last Norse in the eastern settlement were negotiating their own final decades, the turf walls up in the western fjords were already sagging, the byres standing open, and the paths to the outer coast were being snowed over and forgotten. If the western settlement was the outstretched hand of Norse Greenland, Walrus ivory was what it was reaching for. Because for all the hayfields and sheepfolds and parish churches, Greenland was not just a place people lived. It was a node in a much larger machine, the North Atlantic trade network that tied tiny farms on cold fjords to the desires of bishops and princes thousands of kilometres away. On the face of it, that sounds absurd. Greenland sits almost literally at the end of the known world as medieval Europeans imagined it. It was reached only by a long sail from Iceland, which was itself a long sail from Norway. There were no cities, no markets, no roads, just scattered farms, a cathedral at Gardar, and a handful of anchorages that barely qualify as harbours. And yet, somehow, things moved. Ships from Norway, and sometimes from Iceland, crossed to Greenland on a rough but semi-regular rhythm, at least during the colony's prime. Not like a modern shipping schedule with timetables and guarantees, but more like pulses. Some summers, 2 or 3 ships might arrive. Other years, none at all. Storms, sea ice, political trouble back home, any of these could break the chain. When they did make it, the ships brought what Greenland could not produce for itself: iron, timber, tar, pitch, finer textiles, maybe a few luxuries like glass beads or metal church vessels. In return, they needed something worth the weeks of risk and cost to cross the North Atlantic. That something was almost never grain. You don't sail to Greenland to load up on hay. It was furs, hides, a few specialised products, and above all, walrus. Walrus were Greenland's export furs. You don't hear about new navigation routes or improved ship designs. You don't know that Portuguese and Spanish sailors are creeping down the coast of Africa, while your entire world remains the same narrow stretch of fjord. Isolation doesn't arrive as a dramatic curtain dropping. It seeps in as silence. From Europe's vantage point, Greenland slipped from remote but useful outpost to distant marginal territory we're not sure is worth the effort. From Greenland's side, kings and bishops and merchants receded into rumour and memory, and that's the crucial part for understanding what happens next. The fate of Norse Greenland wasn't just dictated by colder winters or by how well they did or didn't get along with Inuit neighbours. It was being shaped, quietly, by decisions made in plague-stricken ports and royal halls thousands of kilometres away. Decisions about which voyages to fund, which debts to forgive, which bishopric to actually staff, which frontiers mattered enough to save when there wasn't enough manpower to save them all. By the late 1300s, the answer, increasingly, was that other frontiers mattered more. For a society perched at the edge of habitability, that kind of neglect is not neutral. It's lethal, but on a slow timescale. It turns what might have been a severe but survivable local crisis into something that, over a few generations, becomes terminal. As the ships thinned out, as markets shifted, as Europe's priorities swiveled away, Greenland's Norse farmers were left to face climate stress, resource competition, and social strain with fewer tools, fewer allies, and fewer options. The archaeological record of the next century preserves the echoes of that narrowing horizon. Not in written pleas to distant kings, but in bones, building changes, and the subtle traces of lives under escalating pressure. So what does escalating pressure actually look like when all you have left are stones, bones, and trash? In Greenland, the first thing you notice is absence. Archaeologists talk about abandonment signatures. On paper that sounds clinical, but in the ground it's surprisingly intimate. A healthy farm leaves a particular archaeological heartbeat. Layers of manure building up in the infield, ash dumps growing year by year, broken tools discarded near working areas, fresh middens accumulating outside the door. When a place is slowly let go, that rhythm stutters. In the later phases of the eastern and western settlements, you start to see farms where the middens thin out. House floors stop receiving new layers of trampled straw and debris. Outbuildings that once hosted animals or storage are left to collapse. Sometimes you find a farmhouse with its main dwelling still in use, but the satellite buildings, byres, sheds, smaller sleeping houses, have gone quiet. It's like listening to a piece of music and realizing whole instruments have dropped out one by one. Midden contents change too. Early layers are rich, messy, and frankly disgusting. Heaps of cattle and sheep bones, discarded iron fragments, broken ceramics, fish remains, seal bones, evidence of people eating heartily and wearing out tools. Later layers, when they exist at all, often tell a leaner story. More seal, more fish, more fragile bird bones, less cattle, less pig. Bones are more thoroughly chopped and split, suggesting every last bit of marrow and fat was being extracted. To be clear, that shift doesn't automatically scream starvation. It can also mean people got better at exploiting marine resources as the climate cooled, or that they were deliberately pivoting away from risky cattle toward more reliable seal and caribou. But taken together with declining numbers of occupied farms, it's a pattern that looks a lot like a society retreating to the margins of its own landscape. Then there are the places that go from farm to nothing in a single archaeological breath. In some valleys of the western settlement, you see a dense cluster of farmsteads early on, and then the later cultural layers just stop. No burning, no mass graves, no final layer of desperate repairs. The last occupation horizon looks almost normal, and above it is centuries of wind-blown sand and turf collapse. People left or died out in ways that left very little drama for us to read. If abandonment and trash patterns give us the background hum of decline, churches and cemeteries provide the closest thing we have to a human voice. The Norse in Greenland built a surprising number of churches for such a small population. Stone chapels and parish churches scattered along the fjords. Around those churches grew cemeteries, and in those cemeteries lie hundreds of individuals whose bones preserve clues about their lives. At first glance, the burial record looks reassuringly normal. Bodies are laid out east-west, Christian style, with relatively consistent grave depths and orientations. There isn't a sudden spike in mass graves, no obvious layer of plague pits like in Europe. That absence has led some researchers to argue against catastrophic epidemics as the main driver of collapse. But when you look closer, the bones suggest strain. Several cemetery studies have found increasing signs of nutritional stress over time. More enamel hyperplasias on teeth, those faint lines and pits that record episodes of childhood hunger or disease. More evidence of stunted growth in some individuals. Pathologies on bones that suggest heavy workloads and joint strain, especially in women, consistent with people working harder for fewer returns in harsher conditions. You also see demographic oddities. In some late cemeteries, there appear to be relatively few young adult males. That could mean a lot of things: men dying at sea on long hunting or trading voyages, young men leaving the colony, sampling bias in which graveyards have been excavated. It's not a smoking gun. But it fits a picture where the community is losing precisely the age group that does the most dangerous high-investment tasks. What burials don't give us is clarity on the final act. There is no cemetery where burials suddenly stop with an unmistakable last grave you can point to and say, "This was the end." Most churchyards show a tapering off of use, not a hard cut-off. Some graves may even post-date the last written records, hinting that people were still being buried in the old Christian way, after regular contact with Europe had already waned or ceased. Buildings tell their own story of adaptation and retreat. Early in the colony's life, many farmhouses are big, sprawling affairs by Arctic standards. Longhouses with multiple rooms, thick turf walls, sometimes stone linings. Over time, especially in the later periods, you begin to see more modest structures, tighter floor plans, and a growing emphasis on insulation. Walls are rebuilt thicker, inner rooms are subdivided, entrances get more convoluted to keep out drafts. That could reflect climate. Colder, windier winters pushing people to huddle into smaller, more heat-efficient spaces. There are also more repairs using whatever comes to hand. Instead of replacing a rotting wooden element with fresh imported timber, you see stone substituted or older beams reused, cut down, repurposed. Roofs that might once have used robust wood frameworks increasingly lean on stone gables and heavy turf, minimizing the need for rare, long straight timbers. It's the architectural equivalent of patching your coat for the third time, because you know you're not getting a new one. Some scholars read that as straightforward evidence of scarcity, less access to imported wood and iron, declining capacity to build big, fewer people to maintain large complexes. Others highlight the ingenuity, the way Greenlanders redesigned their architecture to stretch limited resources and survive in a changing climate. Neither view is wrong, they just emphasize different sides of the same adaptations. Even downsizing itself is ambiguous. A smaller house can mean poverty and population loss, or it can mean a conscious, rational response to colder weather and shifting household sizes. Consolidating from several farmsteads into one stronger, better-positioned farm in a valley could be strategic resilience, not simple failure. And that brings us to one of the most frustrating and fascinating parts of the archaeological record. Very little of it points in only one direction. Take the increase in seal and fish bones. Is that a red flag of agricultural collapse forcing people onto the sea? Or is it a smart pivot to the resources that actually thrive in a colder North Atlantic, especially if you're short on hay for overwintering cattle? Take the signs of nutritional stress in bones. Do they represent a whole society in crisis, or the experience of specific vulnerable households, while others managed relatively well? Take the thinning out of farms in the Western settlement. Is that population decline, or a calculated decision to abandon the least productive marginal lands and concentrate effort where survival odds were higher? Almost every piece of evidence can be read along at least two tracks, as decline or as adaptation. Often, it's probably both at once. What we can say with some confidence is that by the 1300s and early 1400s, Norse Greenland looked very different from the thriving farm network founded in Erik the Red's day. There were fewer occupied farms, more modest buildings, more improvisation with local materials, and a diet that leaned harder on wild resources. The cemeteries show people whose bodies carried the marks of hard lives under environmental and economic strain. But the archaeology stops short of spelling out the final sentence. There is no burned-out layer marking a last battle. No line of skeletons huddled together in a church nave. No cache of hastily buried treasures that never got reclaimed. Just a gradual thinning of traces, a slowing of that societal heartbeat, until at some point the shovels hit only sterile soil and wind-blown sand. To move any closer to the end, we have to leave the bones and stones for a moment and turn back to the few, fading voices that did write things down, because the last written hints from Greenland are as tantalizing and as incomplete as anything in the ground. The written trail from Greenland doesn't end with some dramatic last entry that says, "Today, we all died." It fades out in a series of short, almost offhand mentions that only feel ominous in hindsight. The clearest of those is from 1408. That year, at the Church of Valsey in the eastern settlement, a couple named Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Björnsdottir were married. We know their names, the date, and the witnesses, because the marriage was recorded later in Icelandic church documents. It's wonderfully mundane. A wedding, at a stone church whose ruins still stand, with enough people and authority present for the ceremony to be properly recognised. That wedding looks very normal, and it's also the last fully secure written record of Norse Greenlanders living their lives in Greenland. After that, the sources get thinner, patchier, and more ambiguous. In the decades before and after 1408, you see occasional references to Greenland in Scandinavian documents, royal letters, church records, trading permissions, but they're increasingly second-hand, talking about what should be happening rather than what anyone has actually seen. There are notes about bishops being appointed for Greenland, even when there's no evidence the man ever actually made the journey west. There are records of church tithes from Greenland being claimed in Norway, even when it's not clear if any ships had visited recently enough to collect them. You start to sense a gap. The administrative machinery in Europe still has Greenland on its paperwork, long after regular contact has probably faltered. One royal letter from the mid-15th century complains that no ships have come from Greenland for a long time, and urges that contact be re-established. The tone is revealing. Greenland is treated as a distant, neglected outpost, not a place anyone in the Royal Chantry knows firsthand. It sounds like people in Norway are already realising that the line has gone quiet and are trying, at least on paper, to plug it back in. And then there are the later stories, the ones that keep the mystery alive precisely because they might not be true. Several 16th century sources talk about a ship blown off course, stumbling upon Greenlanders who still lived in stone houses but dressed in skins like savages. Another relates that sailors reached an abandoned settlement where they found dead people in their beds, as if frozen in place. These tales are dramatic, cinematics, and highly suspect. They're written long after the fact, often by people who never went to Greenland themselves. Details shift between versions. Sometimes the encounter is placed in one fjord, sometimes another. Sometimes the Greenlanders are living, sometimes they're corpses. The stories seem to borrow elements from earlier legends, from general European ideas about lost colonies, and from a growing fascination with the exotic north. Historians have argued about them for centuries. Are they garbled memories of a real late contact? Or are they essentially ghost stories, told to audiences who already knew that Greenland had once been settled and was now, in their minds, empty? The cautious answer is, we don't know. None of those later accounts can be nailed down tightly enough to use as solid evidence for the colony's final years. At best, they hint that by the 1500s, people around the North Atlantic were already treating Norse Greenland as a place that had slipped away into myth. But even if you stripped all that away and only kept the hard early 1400s documents, one thing is clear. The records stop before the people necessarily did. Medieval paper trails vanish for all kinds of prosaic reasons that have nothing to do with sudden mass death. Ships stop sailing regularly because trade isn't profitable, or because wars and plagues at home consume attention. A bishopric on the edge fails to send reports for a decade because the man in charge died and no one bothered to replace him. Archives burn, letters rot in damp storerooms. Scribes simply don't write certain things down. From the Greenlanders' perspective, the disappearing ink in Norway or Iceland might have been almost irrelevant. If fewer ships were coming, that was a problem for trade and for church politics, but it didn't mean your farm stopped existing. It just meant your world got smaller. So what might those last decades have looked like on the ground? Picture the eastern settlement not as a bustling frontier, but as a string of surviving farms holding on along the best fjords. Many of the marginal outliers are gone. Families have consolidated into the few places where hay still grows reliably, where you can reach hunting grounds and seal leads without a week-long journey. You'd probably know, by name, almost every household in your district. Marriages are arranged not just for romance or land, but to keep some kind of viable network stitched together. Who still has cattle? Who has a seaworthy boat? Who can still send a son north in summer and trust he might actually come back? Winters are longer, harsher, and more unpredictable. One bad year doesn't destroy you, but 3 in a row start to eat into the breeding stock. You thin the herd again. You ask cousins if they can spare a goat. You lean harder on seal hunts and caribou drives. You stretch your stores of imported iron by reforging old nails, by treating every broken knife as raw material for a smaller one. The church bells, if they still have bells, ring less often. Priests may be scarce or absent. Some churches might function without one, with laypeople trying to maintain Christian rites as best they can. Burial practice, as the archaeology suggests, remains Christian in form, but the certainty that someone in Norway is thinking about your souls probably feels very faint. It's a society that's still Norse, still Christian, still recognisably descended from Erik the Red settlers, but thinner, more tightly wound, and more fragile. A metapopulation of farms has collapsed into a handful of knots on the map. The margin for error is razor thin. In that situation, it wouldn't take a single giant catastrophe to erase the written record. It would only take a few bad decades and a lack of visitors. A last trading ship might arrive to find fewer people than expected, fewer walrus tusks, fewer furs. The voyage isn't worth the risk anymore. Merchants stop planning Greenland runs. A final bishop dies with no replacement. Somewhere an archivist files the last letter mentioning Greenlanders without realising it's the end of a series stretching back centuries. Meanwhile, in the fjords, people are still getting up, cutting turf, hunting seal, arguing about grazing rights. Until one year a family decides to abandon a farm and move in with relatives down fjord. Another sends a boat west or south and simply doesn't return. Children grow up having never seen a ship from Europe, hearing about Norway and Iceland as half-remembered names from their grandparents' stories. At some point the last Greenlander who was born into that original Norse world dies. But that doesn't necessarily mean every person of Norse descent on the island vanishes in that instant. Which brings us to the question that hangs over every ruined church and empty farmhouse. What actually happened to them? Did the remaining communities dwindle until no one was left? Death by 1,000 small cuts? Hunger, disease, accidents, storms? Did some families give up and sail away, aiming for Iceland or Labrador or even farther, their fate unrecorded? Or did a fraction of them do something more complex, gradually intermarry, trade, and finally merge with the Inuit communities who were thriving in the same waters? The last written hints can't tell us. They only mark the point at which Europe stopped listening. To get closer to an answer, we have to go beyond the documents entirely and ask a harder question. Given everything we know about the environment, the economy, the archaeology, and their neighbours on the ice, why did Norse Greenland, as a distinct society, vanish from history at all? When people hear an entire colony vanished, the human brain immediately reaches for a single cinematic cause, a last terrible winter where everyone starved at once, a plague that swept through like a scythe, a massacre in the snow. Those stories are satisfying because they're simple. They give you one big hammer that explains everything. But when you line up the evidence from Greenland, the climate data, the trade records, the bones in the graves, the abandoned farms, you don't see one hammer. You see a whole toolbox of smaller blows spaced out over generations. So let's walk through the main suspects one by one and then put them back together. Start with climate. Ice cores from Greenland and tree rings from Europe agree on the broad outline. After a relatively mild medieval period, North Atlantic temperatures slid downward from the 1200s into the 1400s. The so-called Little Ice Age didn't turn Greenland into an instant wasteland, but it did make a hard place harder. Growing seasons shortened, Sea ice extended farther and lasted longer. Storm patterns shifted. We can see the colony adjusting. Pollen and plant remains suggest less barley, more hay and scrub. Animal bones from later layers show fewer cattle and more goats and sheep, hardier animals that tolerate poorer forage. There's also a striking rise in seal bones, especially from species hunted in sea ice leads. That's powerful, supporting evidence that climate stress was real and escalating, but it has limits. The Inuit arrived and flourished in roughly the same period, exploiting the same icy seas. The eastern settlement lasted for centuries after the first signs of cooling. Climate alone doesn't explain why one culture adapted successfully and the other eventually did not. It sets the stage, it isn't the whole play. Next, trade. From the beginning, Norse Greenland was plugged into a North Atlantic economy. Walrus ivory, hides, maybe falcons and polar bear skins went east. In return, iron, timber, cloth and prestige goods came west. For a long time, scholars saw ivory as the colony's lifeline, and then something important showed up in the archaeology and the records. Demand shifted. By the late 1200s and 1300s, elephant ivory from Africa and Asia became more accessible to Europe. At the same time, changes in artistic styles reduced the high status of carved walrus tusk. When we chemically analyse ivory from medieval European artefacts, we can actually see Greenland's share declining over time. In other words, the thing Norse Greenland was uniquely good at supplying became less valuable, supporting evidence. Fewer documented trading voyages, complaints in royal letters about the difficulty and cost of the Greenland run, and a general downturn in long-distance commerce during the crises of the 14th century. Think the Black Death, wars and political turmoil in Norway. The limitation. Greenlanders weren't entirely dependent on imports for day-to-day survival. You can live, herd, and hunt without new church bells and fancy cloth. The weakening of trade doesn't automatically kill communities, but it does strip away resilience. Without regular ships, you get less iron, fewer tools, fewer new people coming in to marry and replenish numbers, less external support in bad years. The safety net frays. What about conflict, especially with the Inuit? Archaeology shows overlap. Norse artifacts appear in Inuit sites. Inuit tools and techniques sometimes surface in Norse layers. There are Icelandic texts hinting at hostility with Skraelings in the western lands. Skeletal remains from a couple of Norse sites show injuries that could be from violence, though they're few and hard to interpret. So coexistence certainly wasn't always peaceful. Two cultures using some of the same hunting grounds in a tightening climate were bound to rub against each other. But if there had been a single genocidal clash, Norse wiped out in one great battle, you'd expect clearer signatures, mass graves, distinctive trauma patterns, burning on a large scale. So far, nothing like that has been found. The evidence points instead to a more complicated frontier: trade, occasional intermarriage, some borrowing of ideas, probably flashes of violent conflict. Enough tension to make life riskier, not enough proof to crown one big war as the cause of disappearance. Then there's disease. Here the record is especially slippery. Medieval Europe was hammered by plagues, most famously the Black Death in the mid-1300s. If a ship crewed by infected sailors made it to Greenland, disease could have devastated small scattered communities with no prior exposure. But we don't have written reports from within Greenland describing outbreaks. We don't have skeletal evidence that clearly shows plague lesions, and we don't even know how many ships were reaching the colony in the most plague-heavy decades. Disease almost certainly struck at times. Every human society deals with waves of illness, but pinning the colony's long staggered decline on a single epidemic goes beyond the evidence. It's a plausible contributor, not a proven assassin. Finally, emigration. In some ways, this is the quietest and most powerful explanation. Nothing in human history suggests that people sit passively on failing farms until the last child starves. They move, they consolidate, they send out scouts, they gamble on leaving. We know Norse Greenlanders had the ships and the knowledge to reach Labrador, Newfoundland, Baffin Island. We know they had ties to Iceland and Norway, even if those ties grew thin. We also know, from the archaeology, that some farms in Greenland seem to have been abandoned in an orderly way. Valuable items taken, doors left open, not bodies in every room. The supporting evidence here is mostly negative space. Fewer and fewer graves in the later centuries, houses that show signs of decline and then neat desertion, not sudden catastrophe. Oral traditions among Inuit groups that talk, in variously distorted forms, about pale outsiders who were once there and then were not. The limitation. We haven't yet found an Icelandic or Canadian parish register that suddenly fills with new arrivals from Greenland. There's no single document saying, on this date 20 households sailed east and arrived safely. If people left, they vanished into other communities' records, unremarked or indistinguishable. Put all of this together, and a pattern emerges. The climate squeezes the margins, trade weakens, so you can't easily compensate with imported resources or new settlers. Disease and conflict chip away at already small populations. Young people look around, compare a shrinking, harsher Greenland with tales of easier lands east or west, and start taking the risky option of leaving. Not in one heroic exodus, but family by family, decade by decade. Some farms fail outright in bad winters, others are absorbed by neighbours, a few are abandoned as entire households attempt a sailing that never makes it. A trickle of survivors fold themselves into Inuit communities or into distant Norse ones. Birth rates fall below replacement. Elders die without enough grandchildren nearby to keep all the turf roofs patched and the cattle fed. From the outside, viewed centuries later, it looks like a disappearance. From the inside, it probably felt like slow unravelling. That's why single event stories are so tempting. They compress a messy, multi-generational process into a moment. They give you a dramatic last chapter, where the real history offers only a long, fading epilogue. The most honest synthesis is this. Norse Greenland didn't vanish because of climate or trade or conflict or disease or emigration. It vanished because of all of them at once. Each generation faced slightly worse conditions, slightly fewer options, slightly thinner connections to the outside world. No one cause was necessarily fatal on its own. Together, over time, they nudged a fragile, isolated society past the point where it could sustain itself as a distinct Norse Christian colony. And even then, that still leaves one more layer to the mystery. If the colony as an institution died by slow degrees, what about the people themselves, their bodies, their genes, their stories? Did any part of Norse Greenland survive in other populations, in other coastlines, in other names? To chase that possibility, we have to stop thinking just about why a society failed and start asking where its people might have gone. So let's follow them. You're a teenager in the eastern settlement around 1400. The winters are longer than your grandparents remember. The priest mutters that no ship has come from Iceland in years. The iron tools in the shed are worn to stubs. You've heard rumours from hunters and from Inuit visitors, lands to the west with rich hunting, or ships from the east that sometimes still appear in the summer fog. What are your options? One route runs backward along the chain your ancestors used to arrive. Greenland to Iceland, Iceland to Norway. We know that ships were still sailing the North Atlantic in the 1400s, even if they visited Greenland less and less often. A few could have come, late in the colony's life, bringing news of the wider world and offering passage. A small group, maybe a household, maybe just a few restless young men and women, could have bartered their way to Iceland. Once there, they would not have been exotic strangers. They spoke the same language, sang the same hymns, followed the same law codes. They were, in a legal sense, still part of the Norwegian realm. Arrive in an Icelandic harbour with no property, no kin letters, and a weather-beaten Greenland accent, and what happens? You hire on as labour. You marry into a local family. After a generation or two, your descendants are just from that valley over there. The fact that their grandmother was born under turf roofs in Greenland becomes a family curiosity, not a line in any official record. There are tantalizing hints that something like this may have happened. A couple of late medieval Icelandic texts mention Greenlanders arriving after long absence. A 15th century document records a bishop complaining about people who had fled from Greenland. None of these are smoking guns. They're more like faint echoes. But they show that, in principle, eastward emigration was noticed, briefly, then absorbed into normal life. Another less discussed route runs sideways, not back, down the Greenland coast across Davis Strait to the familiar hunting grounds of Labrador and Baffin Island. We already know Norse sailors were using this western corridor centuries earlier. The archaeological sites at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland and stray Norse artefacts along the Canadian Arctic prove they had the seamanship and the knowledge. If the farms at home were failing, what's more likely, that they suddenly forgot the way, or that they leaned harder on routes they already knew? Now imagine a small ship leaving the eastern settlement, not for Iceland but for a known bay in Labrador where they'd once cut timber or hunted. If they made it, they'd find a landscape where Norse iron tools and woodworking skills still had value, but where they were very far from home in a political sense. There was no Norwegian crown here, no bishop to report to, just whatever alliances you could make with the people already living there. That brings us to the second possibility. Not eastward return, but local integration. Did any Greenland Norse end up living as part of Inuit communities? The idea isn't new. Inuit oral traditions collected in the 19th and 20th centuries mention light-skinned people, sometimes called kavdlunite, or similar terms, who built stone houses and disappeared. Some stories say they died out. Others hint that a few married in, trading wood and metal for knowledge of sea ice and seals. Material evidence gives this a shadowy outline. Inuit sites in the Canadian Arctic and Greenland sometimes contain unmistakably Norse objects. Iron nails reworked into tools, bits of chainmail, carved wooden pieces that don't match Inuit traditions. At a few Norse farms, archaeologists have found harpoon heads and other Inuit-style hunting gear appearing in later layers, suggesting at least some exchange of ideas and perhaps people. What we don't have is a clean, obvious hybrid site, an unmistakable Inuit settlement full of Norse-style houses and Christian crosses, or a Norse church with Inuit burials in the yard. That doesn't mean integration never happened. It mostly means that, if it did, it was small-scale and gradual, not a mass cultural fusion that leaves an archaeological billboard. Genetics might seem like the perfect tool to resolve this, but here the picture is just as murky. Modern Greenlandic Inuit do carry bits of European ancestry, but a lot of that arrived after 1500 with Danish colonisation, whaling and modern contact. Teasing apart medieval Norse from 18th century Danish sailor inside a strand of DNA is not straightforward. So far, studies haven't produced a clear, agreed-upon signal that shouts, here is a distinct, older European component that must come from the Norse colony. That absence argues against massive, widespread intermarriage. It does not rule out a handful of families folding in here and there, their genetic traces diluted over 600 years of subsequent history. On the cultural side, some scholars have looked for Norse fingerprints in Inuit stories, tools or rituals. Again, the results are mixed. A few motifs could reflect memories of strange neighbours to the south. A few technological quirks might represent borrowed ideas. But cultures adapt and borrow all the time. It's hard to prove that any specific detail is a fossil of Norse-Inuit integration rather than an independent invention. This is where it helps to zoom out and think about what it means for a community to vanish. States and churches keep records. They notice when parishes stop paying tithes or when tribute fails to arrive. Archaeologists notice when a material culture, the way people build houses, the style of their pottery, the form of their churches, stops appearing in the ground. Individuals don't vanish in that same neat way. They can do something much less dramatic and much more common. They stop being counted as a separate category. If you leave Greenland in 1430 and show up in Iceland, you're a Greenlander for maybe one generation. If your daughter marries a local farmer, your grandchildren are just Icelanders. If you marry into an Inuit family somewhere on the coast, your European-style clothes rot away, your language shifts, your grandchildren grow up speaking Inuktitut and learning to read sea ice instead of the Latin Mass. From the perspective of a Norwegian scribe in Bergen, you have disappeared. From the perspective of the world you actually inhabit, you are very much alive, just under a different label. So when we ask, what happened to the people? We're really asking, what happened to their distinct identity as Norse Greenlanders? The answer is probably this. It thinned, frayed, and finally dissolved. Some sailed east and were absorbed into other Norse societies. Some likely died in failed voyages or bad winters, leaving only bones in abandoned churches and unmarked graves beneath collapsed turf. A few may have taken the hardest step of all, staying in the North Atlantic world but switching cultural teams, becoming in every practical sense Inuit. And because none of those paths require a single, documentable moment of drama, the trail goes cold. No chronicler in Europe wrote, on this day the last Greenlander died. No Inuit storyteller needed to say, on this day the last of the strange house builders took a wife from our camp. History usually doesn't announce when a boundary dissolves. It just quietly stops caring. Reframed this way, the mystery of Norse Greenland looks less like a magic trick, 5,000 people here one century, gone the next, and more like erosion. Over 100, maybe 200 years, a distinctive colony turned back into what it had always really been, a small branch of a much larger human network. Its walls, of ice, of distance, of law, of faith, slowly crumbled, and its people seeped out through the cracks. The ruins left behind feel like an ending. But they're really just the places where the records stopped following, and where we, standing in the present, still go looking for the echoes of lives that didn't truly vanish, so much as blend into other stories. Walk around one of those abandoned farms today, and the first thing that hits you is how much is still there. The church walls at Valsey still stand chest high. The doorway still frames the sky. The outlines of longhouses at Bratterlead and Gardar still ripple under the grass. Stone by stone you can trace where barns once stood, where byres held cattle, where fence lines tried to keep a fragile order between inside and the wild beyond. They look like ruins of failure, but look closer and they tell a more complicated story. Those thick stone house walls, they aren't oversized by accident. They're thermal engineering. Packed turf and stone, narrow windows, low doorways, all tuned to trap a little bit of summer heat and hold it through months of wind and darkness. The barns with drainage channels and carefully built stalls. They're an answer to a brutal equation. How many cows you can keep alive through winter with the hay you can cut in a summer that might be snowing in August. Terraces on the hillsides, fields cleared of stones and ringed with low walls, tell the same story. Every square metre of soil that could possibly grow grass was worked. Even marginal patches are turned into hay meadow, sometimes kilometres from the home farm. That's not reckless optimism. It's a sign that people understood exactly where the limits were and were pressing against them with everything they had. Archaeologists read this landscape almost like a diary. They map each ruin, sample the soil, count the pollen grains trapped in ancient mud. And the picture that emerges is not of a naive community that didn't understand its environment, but of one that understood it too well, and ran out of room anyway. Under those green pastures, cores pulled from peat and lake beds show layers of history the settlers never saw but absolutely lived through. At the bottom, before the Norse arrived, there are dense forests of birch and willow pollen. Then, after 985, the signal begins to change. Tree pollen drops, grass pollen rises, microscopic fragments of charcoal spike, evidence of burning to clear land. Sheep and cattle dung leave chemical fingerprints. In a few human generations, a scrubby woodland turns into open grazing. For a while that works. The soils are rich, erosion is low. Then, in later layers, the warning lights start to flash. More erosion. More sand and silt washed into lakes. Less diversity in plant species. It's the signature of a system that's being pushed close to its edge. Layer that with what climate science has added in the last few decades, and the timing gets frighteningly precise. Ice cores from the Greenland ice sheet, drilled miles inland, preserve year-by-year records of temperature, volcanic eruptions, even sea ice extent. When you line those up with radiocarbon dates from the farms, a pattern appears. The Norse arrive in a relatively mild phase. For 2 or 3 centuries, conditions are harsh but manageable. Then, in the 1200s and 1300s, the ice cores record a series of cold pulses. Sea ice expands, summers shorten. The so-called Little Ice Age isn't a Hollywood instant freeze. It's a long, uneven slide punctuated by brutal decades. In those same centuries, the archaeological layers at the farm shift. Cattle bones decrease, goat and sheep bones increase. Seals and caribou and fish, wild foods, become more common in the middens. Barns once built to keep dairy cows now hold a scattering of hardy sheep. Some outlying farms are simply abandoned. Their last trash layers are thin, their hearths cold. You can now see the community adapting in slow motion, step by step, until there is no next step left that doesn't involve becoming something other than Norse Greenland. New tools are helping to sharpen this time-lapse still further. From satellites, remote sensing specialists scan the fjords, looking for the pale rectangles of old fields and the faint scars of boat landings. Ground-penetrating radar can pick out buried walls and graves without turning a single spadeful of soil. LiDAR surveys strip away vegetation in digital models, revealing networks of paths and enclosures no one had mapped before. Suddenly, we see how farms relate to each other across entire valleys. We see which pastures were shared, which were enclosed, how close the Norse got to good hunting grounds, and which routes they might have taken to the open ocean. We can even spot places that might have been seasonal camps. Little clusters of structures too small to be full farms may be used for summer fishing or seal hunting. Each new map tweaks the story. Areas once thought empty turn out to have been cultivated. Ruins once assumed to be isolated make sense as part of a chain. The colony becomes less like two dots on a textbook map, eastern and western settlement, and more like a living web stretched along a long, cold coast. Even with all this, some things remain stubbornly unresolved. We can estimate population sizes, but only inside wide ranges. Was peak Greenland around 2,000 people, 3,000, 5,000? The bones don't come with census labels. We can see that diets shifted towards seals and wild foods, but we can't yet say exactly how much knowledge came from Inuit neighbours versus trial and error. We find more or fewer imported goods in certain layers, less iron, less pottery. But we can't pinpoint the moment when people stopped expecting ships to come at all. There are still empty spaces in the map, valleys that probably held farms we haven't found yet, winter camps that left almost no durable trace, tiny family burial plots that lie under modern buildings or under landslides. Future research will push at those blanks. More refined radiocarbon dating can squeeze the timeline tighter, turning somewhere in the 1400s into probably within this 30-year window. DNA pulled from old bones and even from the soil itself, environmental DNA, might finally give us clearer signals of who was present, in what numbers, and whether any of their descendants are still around in unexpected places. Better climate reconstructions, combining ice cores, tree rings from distant continents, and ocean sediment, may reveal whether the last Greenland generations were living through a uniquely bad few decades, or just the inevitable grinding average of a colder world. All of that matters because Greenland is not just a peculiar medieval side story. It's a case study in how human societies ride the edge between resilience and collapse when they're tied into larger systems. The Norse settlers were never truly isolated. Their survival depended on walrus ivory prices in Paris, on how many ships sailed from Bergen, on what the Norwegian crown and the Church of Rome decided to care about. Their fields and flocks depended on climate patterns set in motion by distant oceans and volcanoes. They adapted, changing their diets, their herds, their hunting, their trade routes, right up until the combined weight of colder winters, thinner soils, and a fraying connection to Europe pushed their identity as Norse Greenlanders past its breaking point. Stand in those ruins and you can feel both sides of that reality. The ingenuity that kept people alive on that edge for nearly 500 years, and the hard limit that finally said, this particular way of being human in this particular place cannot go further. Which leaves one last question hanging over the empty churches and grass-covered walls. In a world where our own economies are just as interconnected and our climate just as capricious, are we more like the ships that sailed away from Greenland in time, or more like the farms that stayed, making the best of each bad year, until the very idea of who they were had to disappear for their descendants to survive? So after all of this, what do we really know? We can say with some confidence that no single villain did the Greenlanders in. Not a Black Death that arrived one autumn and emptied every house. Not a sudden Inuit invasion. Not a single storm that drowned every boat. The evidence we actually have points to something slower, messier, and more human. The climate cooled in fits and starts. Sea ice crept farther down the coast, closing harbours earlier, blocking driftwood and trade. Growing seasons shortened just enough to turn a marginal hay harvest into a lethal deficit every few years. The soils, already thin, eroded and tired under centuries of grazing and cutting. At the same time, Europe's attention drifted. Ivory fell out of fashion. Eastern trade routes opened. The Norwegian crown had other wars to fight, other taxes to collect. Fewer ships meant less iron, less timber, fewer people willing to gamble their lives on a wind-beaten colony with shrinking returns. Inside Greenland, those pressures landed on ordinary decisions. Do you slaughter more cattle this fall and hope the herd recovers? Do you send your strongest hunters south in search of seals, knowing they might not come back before the ice closes? Do you marry your daughter to a man on a more secure farm, or send her west with a family that talks about sailing away? Every answer has a cost. Every choice nudges the community toward one future or another. The archaeology suggests that, over generations, families voted with their feet. Some probably left early, while ships still came, folding quietly back into Icelandic or Norwegian society and telling stories about a hard place they were glad to have survived. Others dug in deeper, shifting to more seals and caribou, maybe borrowing or learning techniques from Inuit neighbours, trying to be Norse in a world that was making that identity more and more expensive. Eventually, there may simply not have been enough people left in any one valley to keep the old structures going. Too few hands to repair the church roof, to crew a ship, to bring in the hay. A longhouse can stand half-used for a while. Then a bad winter takes the last cow, a sickness takes the last elder who remembers how things were done, and a house becomes a ruin. Some people may have died where they were, buried in churchyards and family plots we haven't found yet. Some may have married into Inuit communities, their descendants' Norse ancestry preserved only as a faint echo in DNA and in stories about pale strangers. Some might have made a desperate last voyage, pushing open water while they still could, and either reached another shore or vanished into the North Atlantic without leaving a line in any chronicle. The hard truth is that we may never be able to assign percentages to those endings. 40% died in place, 30% assimilated, 30% escaped. Those are the kinds of numbers we'd like to have, and the kinds the evidence stubbornly refuses to give us. What we are left with is more like a probability cloud shaped by what we do know. A tightening climate vice, a fraying trade lifeline, a small population already stretched thin, and a set of cultural values that made some choices easier to imagine than others. From a distance of 6 centuries, it's tempting to turn the Norse Greenlanders into symbols. Warnings about ecological overshoot, parables about cultural rigidity. Morality plays about colonial arrogance. But under all of that, they were simply people trying to keep their kids warm and fed, trying to honour their dead, trying to square what their faith and traditions told them, with the wind pushing ice into their fjords and the empty horizon, where supply ships used to appear. Their mystery is not that they vanished. Everyone vanishes. Given enough time, the mystery is how long they held on in a place that always wanted to push them out, and how many different ways there were in the end to be gone. So now it's your turn. Based on everything you've heard, ice cores and walrus ivory, Inuit neighbours and empty churches, what's your theory? If you had to sketch the last 100 years of Norse Greenland on a single timeline, what does it look like? A slow fade? A sudden break? A trickle of departures? Or a last desperate leap? Let me know in the comments. And while you're there, tell me where you're listening from. Are you in a city that's already feeling sea level rise? In a farming region watching the seasons shift? Or somewhere that still feels solid, for now? If you enjoyed wandering through this mystery shaped by ice and human choice, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It helps more than you might think, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this are worth sharing. If you'd like to go even deeper into the deep past, into bottlenecks and lost branches of our family tree, I've put together a book about prehistoric secrets, about the near extinction our species survived long before Greenland's farms were ever built, and the strange evolutionary gambles that made us who we are. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. However the Greenlanders' story ended, it's part of a much larger pattern. Small groups of humans facing enormous forces and making the best choices they can with the tools and beliefs they have. That's their world, and it's ours.